The human mind is a fragile architecture, and for Remy Price, that structure finally collapsed into a labyrinth of twisted obsessions and vindictive entitlement. For weeks, he had lurked in the periphery of Forrester Creations, a predatory shadow manipulating his cousin Melissa Dillon with toxic extortion and psychological warfare. But when Eletra Forrester finally uncovered the horrifying truth that the man who had systematically dismantled her mental health with malicious deepfakes was bound by blood to her newly reconciled friend, the walls closed in on Remy. Cornered animals do not retreat. They bare their fangs. Driven into a state of absolute, unhinged madness by the collapse of his extortion schemes and the terrifying exposure of his darkest secrets, Remy resorted to the ultimate, catastrophic act of desperation. He abducted the very woman who had become the focal point of his twisted fixation, dragging Eletra away from the polished safety of Los Angeles and into the desolate, unforgiving wilderness. The remote mountain cabin stood as a decaying monument to isolation, its rotting wooden walls absorbing the terrified, ragged breaths of Eletra Forrester. Bound and helpless, she was no longer just a victim of digital harassment. She was a prisoner in a visceral, physical nightmare. The psychological torture she had endured for months paled in comparison to the suffocating terror of staring into the hollow, manic eyes of her tormentor. The air inside the cabin was thick with the stench of damp pine and impending doom, a claustrophobic purgatory where the outside world seemed to cease to exist. Remy paced the creaking floorboards like a rabid wolf, his voice a venomous hiss as he detailed his horrific ultimatum, stripping away the last remnants of his sanity to reveal the monster lurking beneath his skin. He threatened to unleash a new wave of deepfake videos, digital atrocities so vile, so meticulously crafted and utterly degrading that they would obliterate her dignity, her family's pristine legacy, and her very will to live. He presented her with a sickening, impossible choice: surrender to him, belong to him for all eternity in this isolated, nightmarish cabin, or watch her entire world burn to ash on the digital screens of millions. Electra's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, her mind racing for a solution, a sliver of hope, an avenue of escape. But the heavy iron chains of Remy's madness offered no quarter. She was entirely at his mercy, a pawn in a twisted game of possession that had escalated from digital manipulation to a terrifying, life-or-death hostage situation. Miles away, a different kind of storm was brewing, one fueled not by madness, but by an unconditional, desperate, and fiercely protective love. Will Spencer had just made the most profound decision of his young, turbulent life. After weeks of agonizing indecision, of navigating a messy love quadrangle and being torn between the lingering ghosts of his past with Melissa Dillon and the undeniable, magnetic pull of his future, Will had finally put his heart on the line. He had chosen Eletra, but his definitive romantic declaration was met not with a joyous reunion, but with a terrifying, echoing void. The sudden, inexplicable disappearance of Eletra sent a shockwave of primal panic through the Spencer air. Utilizing the GPS tracking signal from her discarded phone, Will uncovered the terrifying trajectory of her abduction, a digital breadcrumb trail leading straight into the heart of darkness. In that defining moment, the polished, composed facade of the Spencer dynasty fell away entirely, revealing a young man driven by a singular, all-consuming purpose. Will did not wait for the authorities. He did not pause to calculate the risks, consult with security teams, or formulate a strategic response. The volatile blood of Bill Spencer ran hot in his veins, a potent cocktail of fierce protectiveness, unyielding determination, and impulsive rage. Every single second that ticked by was an agonizing eternity that Eletra spent in the clutches of a proven predator. The winding, treacherous mountain roads blurred into a continuous, dizzying streak of gray as Will pushed his vehicle to its absolute mechanical limits, the deafening roar of the engine mirroring the frantic, terrifying pounding of his own heart. He was a modern knight riding into the darkest of forests, armed only with a desperate, burning hope that he would not be too late to save the woman who held his soul. The towering mountain pines seemed to close in around him, casting long, skeletal shadows across the winding asphalt, but Will's focus remained unbroken, locked onto the blinking digital on his dashboard. He vividly remembered the pain in Elektra's eyes when she spoke of the deepfakes, the profound vulnerability she had shared with him. The thought of that same tormentor, now holding her captive physically, was a torment Will could not endure. His knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as he navigated the treacherous curves, his mind playing out 1,000 horrifying scenarios, each one fueling his desperate race against the ticking clock of Remy's instability. When Will finally arrived at the desolate, overgrown clearing, the silence of the mountain was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the chilling, muffled sounds of Remy's unhinged ranting bleeding through the cabin's thin, rotting walls. Will did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. With a feral, desperate strength born of pure adrenaline and boundless love, he threw his entire weight against the heavy wooden door. The frame splintered with a violent crack, and Will burst into the dimly lit room like a localized hurricane, shattering the suffocating atmosphere of the cabin. Dust motes danced frantically in the sudden shaft of moonlight that pierced the gloom, illuminating a tableau of absolute, heart-stopping horror. There was Eletra, pale, trembling, and bound to a heavy wooden chair, her eyes wide with a staggering mixture of profound relief and absolute terror as her savior materialized from the darkness. And there was Remy, his face contorted in a mask of shocked, venomous fury, his hands trembling violently as he raised a cold, metallic glint into the dim light. The standoff was instantaneous and electric, charging the air with a lethal tension that made it nearly impossible to breathe. Will stood his ground, his chest heaving, his eyes locked with unwavering intensity onto the firearm trembling in Remy's unstable grip. In that frozen, terrifying fraction of time, the entire history of their intertwined lives seemed to evaporate, leaving only the raw, terrifying reality of life and death. Remy, his mind entirely unspooled by the sudden, violent destruction of his twisted fantasy, screamed incoherently, his finger tightening dangerously on the trigger. He had completely lost control, and in his fractured, psychotic worldview, if he could not possess Eletra, absolutely no one would. The barrel of the gun swung with terrifying, mechanical finality, aiming directly at the heart of the woman Will loved. Time dilated, stretching a single, fleeting second into an eternity of agonizing clarity. Will Spencer saw the tightening of Remy's knuckles. He saw the lethal, uncompromising intent burning in the madman's eyes. There was no time to reason with the unhinged predator, no time to attempt to disarm, no time to do anything but act on the most primal, selfless instinct encoded in the human soul. As the deafening, catastrophic roar of the gunshot shattered the silence of the mountain, echoing through the valley like a clap of apocalyptic thunder, Will launched his body forward. He did not flinch. He did not hesitate. He threw himself entirely into the trajectory of the bullet, transforming his own flesh and bone into an impenetrable, loving shield for Eletra. The physical impact was devastating, a brutal, kinetic force that lifted Will off his feet and tore through the very core of his being. The sound of the gunshot was immediately followed by a heavy, sickening thud as Will collapsed, his body hitting the wooden floorboards with a devastating finality. The world seemed to stop spinning on its axis. Elektra's agonizing scream ripped through the cabin, a sound of such pure, unadulterated anguish that it seemed to fracture the very foundations of the earth. She tore furiously against her restraints, the rough ropes biting into her wrists as her hands scrambled desperately to reach the young man who had just sacrificed absolutely everything for her. Remy, momentarily paralyzed by the shocking, bloody reality of his own violence, stumbled backward, the smoking gun slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering onto the floor as the incomprehensible magnitude of his actions crashed down upon him. The predator had become a murderer, and the sheer horror of his crime left him frozen in the shadows. Will's vision began to blur, the dim, flickering light of the cabin fading into a soft, encroaching darkness that he could not fight. He felt the frantic, trembling warmth of Elektra's hands pressing desperately against his chest, her fingers slick with the relentless tide of crimson that was rapidly staining his shirt. He could hear her voice, broken, hysterical, and pleading, begging him to hold on, begging him not to leave her alone in the dark. But the cold was already seeping deep into his veins, a numbing, inevitable tide that was pulling him away from the world of the living. Will looked up into Elektra's tear-streaked, terrified face, his own features remarkably calm despite the agonizing, burning pain radiating through his chest. In his final, fleeting moments on this earth, there was no regret in Will Spencer's heart. There was no fear of the encroaching darkness, only the profound, quiet peace of knowing that she was safe, that he had fulfilled the ultimate promise of his love. He reached up with agonizing slowness, his trembling fingers brushing a stray, salty tear from her cheek, his lips parting to form words that required the absolute last ounce of his fading strength. The words were barely a whisper, a fragile, beautiful breath of sound that carried the immense weight of a lifetime of unspoken promises. He told her he loved her. He told her he would always protect her, even from beyond the veil. And then, with a soft, shuddering sigh that seemed to echo through the very soul of the mountain, the brilliant, vibrant light that was Will Spencer extinguished forever. His hand fell limp, slipping from her cheek to rest motionless on the blood-soaked floorboards. His eyes, once so full of fire, ambition, and determination, stared blankly into the shadows of the cabin ceiling. The heir to the mighty Spencer empire, a young man who had just begun to understand the true, boundless depths of his own heart, was gone. Elektra pulled his lifeless body against her chest, rocking him in the suffocating darkness, her wails of grief echoing into the indifferent silence of the mountain night, a haunting requiem for a love that was destroyed just as it began to bloom. The death of Will Spencer is not merely the tragic, heartbreaking conclusion of a young, turbulent romance. It is the catastrophic ignition of an apocalyptic war that will consume everything in its path. When the horrifying news of the tragedy finally reaches the glittering, glass towers of Los Angeles, the city will tremble to its very core. Bill Spencer, a man whose fierce love for his family is matched only by his legendary capacity for absolute, ruthless vengeance, will be shattered beyond all recognition. The loss of his son, his blood, his legacy, his future, will instantaneously eradicate any remaining traces of mercy or restraint within the Spencer patriarch. The profound, suffocating grief will immediately curdle into a blinding, unquenchable rage, a terrifying vow of total destruction that will spare absolutely no one. Bill's wrath will not be confined to the pathetic, unhinged existence of Remy Price. In the agonizing, unforgiving arithmetic of grief, Bill will trace the lines of culpability directly to the grand, imposing doors of Forrester creations. He will look at the toxic, manipulative environment that allowed a predator like Remy to infiltrate their lives through Melissa Dillon. He will look at the petty, vindictive manipulations of Ivy Forrester, the jealous, coercive interference of R.J. Forrester, and the overarching corporate culture of arrogance that kept Will and Elektra in a constant state of turmoil, leaving them tragically vulnerable to this ultimate horror. The Forresters, in Bill's bloodshot eyes, will be entirely complicit in the brutal murder of his son. The simmering corporate tensions, the boardroom power struggles, the petty family squabbles, all of it will be reduced to meaningless ash in the face of a father's apocalyptic vengeance. The blood spilled on the floorboards of that remote mountain cabin will permanently stain the legacy of both families for generations to come. The tragic, heroic sacrifice of Will Spencer saved Elektra Forrester's life, preserving her future at the cost of his own, but it has simultaneously condemned their surviving families to a brutal, unresolvable war of attrition. Love has proven to be the ultimate, unbreakable shield, but the cost of that divine protection is a hatred so deep, so profound, and so violently destructive that it threatens to consume the very foundations of Los Angeles. As the dawn finally breaks over the mountains, casting a cold, indifferent light on the unimaginable tragedy within the cabin, the world of our beloved families is forever, irrevocably changed. The era of polite corporate rivalry has died alongside Will Spencer. The dark, unforgiving era of blood, tears, and total vengeance